Hello and welcome to Data by the Slice. This is a podcast and video series covering a broad range of topics related to data.
We will speak with interesting people who know a thing or two about data and who live and breathe data on a daily basis. Our guests are professionals with whom we talk about what it's like to design, implement and operate data-related frameworks, tools and approaches in real world.
We'll talk about concepts like data mesh, data management, microservice architecture and many other topics with the goal to hear how these work in real life. Our intent is also to get to know our guests, where they come from, what they've learned along the way, and where they see themselves and the world going. I am your co-host Lasse.
And I'm your co-host Antti. Take a comfortable position, get a drink, and have a slice of data with us.
Hello all, and welcome to a special episode of Data by the Slice. Previously, we've spoken with data leaders in large organizations, but today we're speaking with one of our technology partners who are heavily involved in making organizations data literate and data driven. Before we get into that topic, though, a few important notes. We have received a lot of great feedback on the first episodes that were just recently released. It's been very encouraging, and obviously we want all of you to keep that feedback coming. LinkedIn is a really good channel for that purpose, and you should find us there. Any feedback is welcome, whether it is constructive or just simply positive. And then we also want to mention that we are aware there were some technical issues with the first episodes, specifically with the audio. All of those should be fixed now, but if you find anything, obviously do let us know. But again, apologies for a failed quality insurance on those very first episodes.
Our guest today is Aaron Bradshaw from Alation. Alation is one of the leading data catalog product companies, and the topic of data catalog has come up a lot in our conversations. So obviously we thought that it makes perfect sense to hear what the data catalogs have to say about distributed organizations, data mesh, data products, and all the things that we have discussed. Aaron joins us from Chester, UK. He has a long history of data governance and financial industry, and he knows a thing or two about hip-hop, which you will hear in the end. This is our conversation with Aaron.
Great. Hello, Aaron, and welcome to Data by the Slice. Great to have you here with us today.
Thanks for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to join and talk about data.
Exactly. That's what we'll do for the next, 5, 6, 7 hours. We'll see how long this goes. No, just kidding. So we'll start off with the standard questions that we ask all of our guests. And the first one is very simple. How did you get into data?
So quite a boring story compared to a lot of other people. So I did maths and software engineering at university. And then my first job post-university was as a SaaS consultant. So got trained in using SaaS programming for data management tools, and then went into a data warehouse team as a consultant. So quite a boring journey into data warehousing, and then all the fun stuff around that, data lakes, model automation, campaign automation. So quite a structured, non-exciting journey into data.
Oh, well, we'll see. So what is the coolest data-related initiative that you have worked on?
So I guess for me, I've been lucky in that when I worked at a credit card company, we were quite forward thinking. So we won a couple of awards on projects that I was part of, but kind of take away the awards. One of the things that obviously credit cards aren't necessarily the most, don't necessarily have the best reputation, and obviously things such as that. So one of the things that kind of made me proud around what we did was we built a specific piece which was called a mandatory message. So effectively you could kind of bypass all of your marketing and all of that kind of criteria to target people under certain circumstances. And we had two big use cases of that. And one of them was, this is going back around 10 years ago in the UK, we had quite bad floods. So we effectively took all of the areas and we took their postal codes, and so any customer of ours who had a postcode in the area of a flood, we increased their credit limit short term for free, and we took away any interest rates as well. And then anybody who called up the call center from one of those postcodes got prioritized to one. So they bypassed all of the queues effectively because we knew they were likely to be in distress. But we also then gave them preferential treatment, and we didn't try to market them things. We went straight to we know that you're likely to have insurance claims and things such as that. So to facilitate that, we'll help you pay for your replacement goods without being charged interest and fees on top of that. which obviously kind of brings a bit of pride to what you're doing. And then the second part of that was we did kind of a similar type of routine for if your credit card was kind of mass compromised. So again, it wasn't just a case of we'll block your card. It was we did specific training materials on around what mass compromise means, and kind of the kind of the due diligence you can do to stop you doing having that type of problem happening again. So similar types of technology process to make it happen, but kind of the business facing outcome of that and the kind of the human first thing was something that made me kind of proud to do both of those things.
Excellent. I love the first story of actually doing purposeful, meaningful things with data. Great one. Okay, and the third standard intro question, you have to pick a camp. Do you come from the monolithic data management camp or from the microservice software developer camp?
Sure. So I spent over 13 years working in banks, so probably not much of a surprise to hear that I come from the monolithic data management camp. I think kind of through necessity to some extent, obviously the amount of regulations and due diligence required in banks, and then obviously just the sheer size of the organizations means that typically they don't move as fast as the kind of the smaller and modern tech companies.
And when we talked about this earlier, we had a really good conversation on this. So why is traditional data management monolithic? Why did it occur that way?
So for me, I think a big part of it is that if you go back even 20 years ago, data governance as a concept didn't exist really. There were kind of some people doing various things to help people get the most out of their data, but there was just a huge expectation that data would be owned, would be managed, would be controlled by IT. So business users had no input into anything apart from we need a report and things such as that. And I think that meant that then people within IT, one, potentially didn't have the business expertise to go away and do things better, but then also didn't have the time and the resource to do so. So things such as data quality, as an example, somebody in IT probably knew that it was something good to do and created data quality rules, but everything that they created didn't necessarily have the right business process and escalation to try to facilitate some data remediation activities and things such as that. Whereas if you look at kind of the more forward-thinking modern way to go through things, it's always focused on empowering the business owners to make decisions because the message is that data belongs to the business, not to IT. So I think it's changed a lot over the past 15, 20 years. And I think the big reasons for that is that one, technology has got better. So, and then two, things such as self-service analytics. If you're in a line of business and you want to go away and create yourself a really nice Tableau dashboard, that's started to make data become more prominent in that business area. And by making that data become more prominent in that business area, instantly you're going to care about the quality of the data that goes into your reports because you will actually understand the implications of where the report's coming from and where that report goes to as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's you actually touch upon a sort of the new way of thinking and putting a lot more emphasis onto the business and giving them flexibility to do that. And that starts to sound awful like data mesh. When did you first hear about data mesh and what was your initial reaction to it?
So I guess it was kind of around a year ago. And I guess my first thought was just it was a bit of a smile. And I guess kind of exactly like you say there, I think slowly but surely there's a shift where organizations are realizing that people talk around data-driven culture, data value, and all the things such as that. Data is the new oil and all of those conversations. And I think people are slowly realizing that IT don't own data. IT maintains systems which store data, and obviously they can go in there and fix data if it's incorrect and things such as that. But I like to compare it to kind of DevOps, and if you look at the ethos behind that, it's trying to get people within organizations more involved in some type of technology practice. And obviously that's where data ops is going, and then data mesh to me just fits into that story nicely, that the ultimate ethos is that all of these things aren't being done just for IT's sake. IT should exist to help drive value for the business. And without the business and the business values and all of the things that the business is aiming to get to, IT just wouldn't exist is the reality. So for me, I smiled around it just because it's an ethos that kind of hits home for me. And I think we're slowly seeing that shift, not just in kind of the data world, but in everything, every aspect around IT as a whole is slowly moving towards the acceptance that we can do better for business areas.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a repeating theme when we ask this question. A lot of people say that, we finally have a name for this, or it clicks and it puts a smile on your face. So it kind of relates to everything to the same theme here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things, it's kind of not going anywhere. The debates around who owns data, who owns architecture, who owns all these various things within IT. I think if you go back 15, 20, 30 years, it was just IT own everything and the business don't really get a say. And I think a big part of that is obviously that technology 30 years ago wasn't very mainstream. And obviously you look at things over the past 10 years, how open source programming languages have exploded. You've got YouTube videos for free, which kind of give people tutorials on how to write code in Python and R and things such as that. That's obviously trying to get the mainstream used to writing code even. And then you think about data doesn't have to be as complicated as writing thousands of lines of Python code. So if you go back to that, let's actually think about data as a whole, take away any of the technical implementations of that. What do you want to achieve with your data, and what information do you need about that data to be able to succeed? That's ultimately what data mesh feels like to me, and it aligns quite nicely to my thoughts on data governance shouldn't be a restrictive process. Data governance should be an enabling and empowering function for lines of business to make the correct decisions with their data.
The one thing I'm listening to this conversation, I'm just thinking here, because we asked this question about the camps. Do you come from the monolithic camp or the software developer camp? Just thinking about even the names there, I think one of the big cultural differences there is that software developer or developing services like that, it was always driven by the end product. Whereas I think the clue is even in the name, data management was heavily focused on just like managing the ingredient, the data itself. But whereas software development is like, let's get a product out there that people can use. And so even there's like a culturally a different aspiration of what these two camps were essentially focusing on. And it makes total sense, as you said, data management was heavily IT driven and from a control and governance point of view.
Yeah, you make a really nice point there. I think on the software engineering piece, like you say, because the nature of the word engineering, and obviously then you've obviously got the alignments, and you've had all of the traditional engineering outside of IT things that have been focused on process improvements. So your various kind of your Kanban, your agile, and all things such as that. It's always been focused on, like you say, the software engineering side first, because the nature is that, exactly like you say, if you're building an interface for people are going to have some type of requirements, and then when the product gets delivered to them, they're going to look at that interface and see whether it met their requirements or not. Whereas you think about data, I think people ask for a report on how many customers do we have as the basic example, and nobody knows what they really want in the report. It's always a little bit vague, so you almost have to go away and prototype something and show them, and then they can kind of iterate through that. And I think that's kind of what's driven out some of the problems long term, has been that organizations that didn't have that agile delivery mechanism of reports and things such as that, and they didn't have prototyping, that's where you started to get those kind of conflicts and pain points, because you look at how software engineering has evolved over the past 30 years, and everything's focused on small sprints and small deliverables that can be measured, and data typically wasn't done like that. And now we're starting to see that more and more, where people are packaging things up. If let's go through iterations of dashboards, because people are realizing the power that you can get from data that goes into dashboards. But let's not try to deliver the best dashboard that's ever been seen on day one, and then make day one 5 times longer than it would have been to get some tangibles. And let's iterate through things. I think it's a nice way to do things.
Yeah, and that's a nice segue into one of the topics that we have discussed here a lot, is which type of organizations does this distributed system approach or architecture fit? And are there organizations that are not really ready for or not fit for a data mesh principle or philosophy? What do you think? Are there some traits that we can say, if it's this type of organization but not this other type?
I think as a whole, I think all organizations could be there. I think the traits is a nicer way to say it. I think there's certain organizations which are probably further along their data democratization journey than others, and I think that's a big piece of it. So obviously working at a data catalog company, one of our indicators would be if you've got a data catalog, you're more likely to be data driven, but that's obviously just one aspect of which I'd say other parts of it are, do you have self-service analytics? And if so, how mature is it? Is it just a concept of, we like the thought of it because we want to allow more people to create dashboards and things such as that? Or is it that you've actually got embedded routines, processes? How do people create their self-service analytics? Do they go from only authorized data sources, or do they go from they can pull in data from wherever they want to, any disparate data sources, any ungoverned data and things such as that? So obviously self-service analytics doesn't have to mean a complete loss of control and empowerment. It can also mean let's only publish kind of authorized, approved, well-governed, well-understood, well-trusted data, and then people can go away and slice and dice that metrics however they want to, versus just because we've got Tableau, we can connect it to endless data sources, smart sheets, spreadsheets without any control. And obviously the wider data management concerns around disaster recovery and backups and security and all those types of things that can't be addressed via some of those mechanisms as well. So for me, I think if you had to answer kind of a very succinct answer, I'd go back to something such as DCAM. So you kind of just some method of data maturity assessment. And I think the reality would be if you're still down at a 1 or a 2 on your data maturity assessment, you're probably not ready for something like data mesh, because you're just going to kind of prevail all of those data management problems that the organization has and just spread them out. Versus if you're up at a 3, 4, or 5, you've probably got quite good architecture, quite knowledgeable people, not just within IT, but within the lines of business. So you're much more likely to be able to have the vision for where you want to get to and be able to deliver on it as well.
Yeah, there's in the development side, there's usually this kind of saying that, monolith is one way, microservice is another, but in the beginning you might not know how to break things apart, so you might start with a monolith, and when you start to understand better, then you start breaking apart. And I think it can be applied here as well to some extent, that if you're not data driven company and you're still starting in this, starting monolithic, or monolithic has a bad ring to it, but starting from central perspective to understand what kind of governance do we need, what kind of data are we dealing with, how are we going to deal with it, might actually make a lot of sense. Then you get better understanding, and then you can start breaking it into pieces. I guess that's one way to put it. But what do you think is the Achilles heel of data mesh? What's the hardest part? Where would you have to focus in order to make it work?
So I think a big part of it is that all of these initiatives don't remove the requirements that you still need some decent architect somewhere. And again, whether you have a kind of a centralized architects team and things such as that who kind of set the standards, or if you have lots of data architects across the organization based on the size of the organization or not, doesn't necessarily matter to me. But I think you still require those standards, best practices, some type of delivery frameworks. You still need some type of coding best practices. So just because you are trying to decentralize everything, it doesn't mean that standards, procedures, frameworks disappear. If anything, they become more important, because if you have no coding standards, you're going to not be able to kind of merge data sets together. You're not going to get the best value out of it. And I guess that can, following on from coding standards, the same for data management standards. You probably still need to have some type of data management policies, data management routines and frameworks, probably realistically some type of process to determine which tools you want to support as an organization and how best to use them. So just picking a BI tool such as Tableau, and if you have some type of guidelines, frameworks, all of those, even templates to deliver things faster from your Tableau dashboards, all of those types of things I think need to be thought about. And it's not just a case of going, everyone can run away and do what they want now, because obviously you're quickly going to end up from a centralized store that maybe might be a bit slower to deliver, but you'll end up into a chaos quite quickly. It's probably the nice way to put it. So I think just because you're decentralizing it doesn't even necessarily mean that you can't have a centralized center of excellence who are at least working through all of those standard processes, procedures, best practices. In some cases, I think it can be even more valuable having that centralized team, and at least then you've got kind of escalation. If things aren't working, you can go to those people to help work things through, but you're still allowing each of those kind of decentralized organizations to go away and do things faster based on their own prioritization, their own business needs.
It sounds like there's still a lot to do for a centralized function or team, whether it's IT or something else. But the nature of the job is changing, and we talked about this before too. The nature is changing from being the builders and the developers to being more of like facilitators, coaches, trainers, the ones who define the ways of working and build the communities or enable and curate the community. So the role, the need is still there. It's just that the nature of the work is changing a little bit. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of the risks that we talk about, obviously, if you're trying to decentralize, the risk is that you're going to create silos of knowledge, which we've probably realistically only been changing from having lots of silos of SME knowledge in the past 5 to 10 years, depending on how mature the organization was. So if you go back to decentralized now without kind of, like you say, those key data strategists effectively in, somewhere in the organization shaping the future, you're quickly going to have those silos of knowledge being split out again. You've got a massive chance of data duplication across the organization, which obviously leads to the chance of getting those reports being inconsistent. The classic conversations around how many customers do we have, and you get 5 different answers based on 5 different reports. All of those things, there's a big risk that they can just return. So exactly like you say, I think the people who've been doing kind of data management routines for the past 10, 15, 20 years, they're probably less likely to be sat there doing now, but they're probably likely to be having a much more important and powerful message behind how do we measure what we're doing, what's our strategy for the future, and also looking at the industry shifts, because again, going back to just the rate of change of technology now, everything is changing so much quicker than it was 20 years ago. So the principles of data probably haven't changed, and the problems that people who are trying to work with data realistically haven't changed. They're just sped up, and they've sped up faster than ever. So you still need those key people in that organization to kind of go away and solve some of those problems, rather than just saying, to me, data mesh doesn't mean just let people go away and do absolutely whatever they want, however they want to, because you'll quickly end up in chaos. It's the message to me is, allow people to deliver their mechanisms based on their current business requirements versus having to go through a big centralized pot and waiting for data engineers to be prioritized based on your work's now important enough for us to look at. So exactly like you say, I think for me, those centralized people just shaping the vision of the future, the tooling, standards, best practices, policies, procedures, all those things that a lot of people in the business probably wouldn't know where to start, and in all honesty probably don't want to. It's kind of getting those kind of data strategy roles and data architects and things such as that in a central part of the organization as that center of excellence, I think can be really powerful.
Yeah. So if you work in the centralized function, influencing skills and things like that are becoming increasingly important. So definitely worth investing in that. Let's switch to talk about data catalogs. You're here obviously also representing Alation, a data catalog product. So let's talk about that for a second. What is, in your view, what is the role of a data catalog like Alation in a distributed system or in a data mesh?
Sure. So I'd say arguably even more important than if you went for a traditional centralized data store. So I think the more that you distribute data sources, no matter how well governed you are, you're still likely to get duplications of data and maybe slightly different definitions of data and things such as that. And I think just by cataloging that, you're more likely to expose those intricacies around how line of business A versus line of business B want to treat and define their data. I'd say I'm quite a pragmatist around it, and I'm not one of the people who'd say you must have one definition and one definition only. I'd say, to me, you have to reflect reality, and sometimes you may have an organization having 2, 3, 4 different definitions of the same piece of data. The critical part to me is that if you have it catalogued and defined with those 4 different definitions and link off to the 4 places where that data gets stored, which uses one of those different definitions, the understanding then that when you create a report and somebody goes away and they say, well, I'm going to use this column here, which has got this definition, the transparency and empowerment to everybody to understand where that calculation's come from is there. And I think that's a huge piece for the catalog journey now, is that using a product like Alation, you're going to connect to your data sources. You're going to probably have more data sources because they're more disparate. Fine, we can catalog them. Using some of the Alation specific functionality, such as popularity and top users, will help each part of the organization understand which pieces of data are actually being used the most, so that it instantly tells you kind of your critical data elements effectively, so which ones need to be governed and curated and have data quality rules, all of those types of things kind of scientifically. And then the kind of the top users piece effectively helps you know who to ask if there are problems, who's probably going to be able to help you curate, and who's probably going to be able to help you create some data quality rules and help you identify where those issues are being kind of arising from. So I think for me, just because you're moving out to having multiple data sources and multiple business areas creating data, I think the data catalog role becomes even more important and can show value even quicker. And I think if you think about the agile approach of delivery of a data catalog tool like Alation, if you want to roll out the product quickly, it only takes one of those business areas to kind of get the message of what you're trying to do, and they'll start to curate and you'll start to show at least one successful use case very, very quickly. And then if you think about kind of the whole data mesh proposal, once one area does it and starts to show success and get value out of it, you're quickly going to get those different areas as well. And if you compare that back to the kind of the traditional, just a data lake and one data lake to rule them all, effectively, you still have to go through the process to determine which area do we think is going to be kind of the early adopter and kind of get the message we're trying to portray on the purpose of a data catalog and kind of data governance and data management as a whole. So in some ways, you can get more out of data mesh because you're likely to find those business empowered users quicker versus having a data lake that's still maintained by IT, and then you're going to reach out to somebody in the business and say, can you curate this data for me?
It's interesting. I think we talked about this earlier in earlier episodes, or then Lasse, we just had a chat, can't remember, but it seems that we're kind of, the trend that's also happening is that if you try to build everything from central perspective, many times you're trying to predict how data is going to be used, which data sets are going to be joined, what would be really interesting, what would be really useful. But now when we look at it from a more distributed approach, it's actually, like you said, the popularity, which are the most interesting data assets, which are being used the most. It's actually like emerging. These connections are emerging based on a need, and we kind of flip this around a bit. It's kind of interesting sort of phenomenon that's happening on the side.
Yeah, no, I like that analogy as well, and I think just kind of that the whole concept as a whole around ETL, which has obviously been around for a long time, versus ELT, is getting more and more prominent and more spoken about. And to me, it's exactly like you say: get data in, and then let people figure out which pieces of data seem interesting to them, and let them go away and do their joins to get the various pieces of data they want together, and then that will then tell you, based on actual use, which pieces of data are most important to the organization versus, like you say, somebody's going to create a data model and try to determine what's going to be the most important data. So we'll build some facts and dimensions based on that, and then suddenly the business requirements change, or there's a strategic initiative that's changed. So you have to go away and remodel everything, which can obviously be slow and painstaking and kind of lose some of that business engagement as well. So exactly like you say, I think that the value of getting let the data loose, let people use the data the way they want to, and then kind of assess and reassess and then figure out, okay, we're seeing patterns on what people are doing with data now, so maybe we do want to start to create some presentation tables to people, but it's actually based on facts of what we know people are doing with data today versus somebody hoping that they can determine what people will do with data.
Data-driven data development.
Yeah.
And I do also just want to sort of emphasize the point you mentioned there too, which is that because I see this a lot when I work with customers, especially on data catalogs or metadata projects, that there's often the perception that we have different definitions of the same data, or they might even be conflicting, and they're not really documented in a structured format. So we're not ready for a data catalog, because first we have to fix this. But I like the approach of saying, actually, it's fine to have different definitions because you have different business processes. They interpret the data in different way, and that's totally fine. The value of a data catalog is to actually make that transparent, visible, discoverable for everyone, so that they can see that actually there are different definitions of the same data set. And the other point there is also that it doesn't, in the beginning, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a standard document format. Even if it's in somebody's head, it is still a definition, and the role of a catalog is to actually make that visible and transparent and, again, discoverable. So it's sort of, don't have too high standards on standardization before you get into the catalog, but instead focus on making things visible and transparent. But another related topic that we're often dealing with data catalogs is the granularity of the data that you want to expose in the catalog. A typical question is like, do you bring in the operational data stores or just the analytical layers? We talked about this with Steve earlier on the show too, about maybe the catalog should be just for data products and not for all the operational data stores. What's your view on this question?
Yeah, and it's an interesting one. And obviously at Alation, we've got a kind of a combination of both. So we do have a lot of customers who solely catalog kind of their presentation areas, the data lake, and no operational systems effectively. And they get great success from it, because obviously, again, a huge piece of it is that kind of, as you mentioned, the data discoverability. So understanding what data exists, where does it come from, how much can I trust it, and can I use it, and then can I reuse it? We do also have a lot of people in the other camp who do go for the full end-to-end life cycle of data, from the point where it gets created, your architectural systems, such as your master system, where's the golden source of data, all of those types of decisions being catalogued as well, and then going through into the analytical layer. I guess for me, some of that comes down to on the sector and which regulations they have to adhere to. So if you think about banking as an example, some of the regulations, especially in the US, around what you have to do with not just your balance sheet effectively, but you have to demonstrate how the balance sheet's been calculated, where the data comes from, which data manipulations have taken place where and who by, and all the things such as that. Obviously, that kind of dictates the necessity to go from an operational system through to analytical. So I think once you see people start to do that, then they start to see the value in doing that as well. So I think if you go back less than 10 years ago, people used to catalogue or do some type of documentation on these regulatory reports because they had to. And then slowly they started to realise that effectively we've got column level lineage for all of our critical pieces of data, because our critical reports go to regulators. And then they started to do similar for your non-regulatory critical processes. So any reports that go to the board, as an example, they do the same on. And then you start to realise that this is actually really powerful information, because if we're going to do a change and we're going to delete a column, you can instantly understand the impact of deleting that column versus the old way of working, where you had to go out there, you had to maybe get a business analyst speaking to 10 different data custodians or tech SMEs effectively to understand the impact of what will happen if we delete this column. And then by going from operational all the way through to analytical and the reporting layers, you get to see that information propagated through a catalogue in kind of seconds effectively. So it can be a really powerful message. However, on the flip side of that, it's obviously a lot more time and effort to maintain that as well. So I think, depending on the use cases and where you're coming from, if you're coming from kind of a risk and control background, I think people can see the benefit of it very quickly, and then they've had to do the work probably anyway. Versus if you've got a use case of you've got a load of new data scientists who are onboarding fast and they need to deliver work quicker. Obviously, connecting to your data lake and your various analytical systems can be a lot quicker and more powerful to get a lot of use cases delivered as well. So I'd say nowadays, I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I think it's solely focused on the organization and their use cases.
Yep, which makes sense, and sort of also the answer to that was to be expected. Another common topic is also we discuss this a lot, is especially as like software development heavy organizations obviously invest in a typical data product layer is a REST API, and they have API management suites and so on. And then we talk about data catalogs. How do these coexist, data catalogs and API management suites, or are they one and the same? Do you need both or just one?
Yeah, absolutely great question. So I think the scope of what a data catalog is and does changes and is evolving. So obviously Alation being one of the forefronts of that is that obviously we want to continuously add more product capability effectively. And an example of that is that we have an API resource, so you can catalog APIs within Alation. So from the Alation ethos behind that is that we want people to know where data comes from and what it can be used for. So if you're thinking about an API, a lot of APIs pull data from somewhere and move it to somewhere else. So if you're wanting to understand whether you can trust some data, it's probably better to know that it's come from an API which is pulling it from an actual recognized system versus it's come from my spreadsheet on my locally stored machine. So obviously those types of information are useful. What I'd say though is that if you think about what an API catalog does, which Alation and no data catalog would do, is they actually manage the creation, the maintenance, the execution of the actual API tooling itself. So whether it's a put, a patch, a get, all of those types of things, who's going to create them, that's not going to be done within a data catalog. And I kind of compare that to a data catalog's role in data management isn't to execute data management functions. So if you think about something such as a data retention rule, you could use Alation to catalog the data, so the metadata to say that this table exists in this system, and you'd maybe say that these columns need to be retained for 5 years. Alation wouldn't be the system which goes away and deletes the data. You'd have to have some wider data management routine to do so, but that can be that central store of knowledge around this is how you can get information about that. And I'd say it's a similar story for APIs, where you'd still have a dedicated API management tool to go away, create new APIs, manage the existing ones, retire old APIs and things such as that. However, you can use your data catalog to catalog those APIs so that users can understand where data comes from and whether they can trust it or not.
Yeah, I think it's really important in future as well as now that you're able to move from the analytical plane to the operational plane. So like you said, that if the data is coming from an API, we might have actually data store or data product created out of this as well. And in the data catalog, you could be able to discover this, but you could also see the API where the actual data is coming from. So if you would develop a machine learning model or somehow start using it in an operational sense, you would probably prefer to use the APIs, and then you could move there. So if you can discover these both from the same tool, that would be really, really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we talked quite a lot here about now the role of catalogs in a distributed system. Earlier we talked about the distributed systems and data mesh and so on. And we touched a little bit on the topic of data governance, but it's a huge topic, and it's something that we talk about all the time. This data mesh principle is based on this principle of sort of letting go of distributing not just the data, but also the accountability and responsibility. How do we make that happen when, especially those of us that come from the monolithic camp where we were used to centrally controlling things? How do we sort of accept that, you know, we can't control everything and we leave that to the different business units?
Sure. So I guess the interesting thing for me around this is that going back to having worked in the monolithic data management camps, even a lot of those organizations were already starting to kind of federate out and distribute out the actual roles of data owners and things such as that. So I think back to a lot of the big banks, they'd still have a centralized data governance team. And again, going back to the kind of the ethos, they'd kind of dictate the vision. So they'd have metadata standards, they'd have data quality standards and things such as that. They'd be the people who selected the tools and maintained the tools. But then the actual data domains and things such as that got federated out. So the actual roles and responsibilities of who's going to create definitions, who's going to maintain definitions, who's going to declare what data quality rules should exist and where they should be executed, and the management of the kind of the dashboarding, the issue management process, all those types of things. They got managed not centrally. So the idea of the central team then was that they kind of pulled all of that information in. So that the idea of having those central teams dictating the standards meant that they could pull in that as an overall mechanism. And then you had the overall visibility of how well the organization as a whole was performing without having to go into this ethos of, again, we're going to drag everybody into these central forums once a month and kind of slow things down and maybe not make much progress. So having that central team which creates the standards and best practices can be really powerful, because they are the visionaries and know what they're doing. But who knows the most about the data that's being used? It's lines of business. And that kind of resonated with me a bit. And then obviously Alation partner with Bob Siner, and he's got his approach of non-invasive data governance. Whether you call it non-invasive data governance by stealth, or as one of my old bosses used to like to say, effectively, if you can get people to do data governance without knowing that they're doing data governance, you're succeeding. So to me, the whole data governance around data mesh is trying to take that to the next level. So if you distribute data out, people go away. They're going to build data. They're going to build things with the data that they want, because it's the information that they care the most about. They're going to build some nice dashboard in Tableau or whatever, but then they're going to quickly go to the case of, well, I built this dashboard. How do I know that this is reliable? I'm going to do some type of governance on it, whether they call it governance or not. They're probably going to curate it because they want the next person in their team, because they know that it's somebody in their team, not somebody in IT anymore, who's going to go away and change that dashboard. So they're going to curate naturally. They're probably going to start to think about data quality more than ever, because they're realizing the implications of making a dashboard that goes to probably their boss or their boss's boss, versus somebody in IT creates a dashboard that goes to somebody they've never spoken to. So it's more powerful. So they care about the curation, they care about the data quality. So instantly they're doing data governance without knowing it. And I think that's a powerful message to me, is that that's the vision for, whether you call it non-invasive, stealth, data utopia. But the idea is that everybody in the organization is doing data governance because ultimately it is the right thing to do. Everybody says that data is an asset. So if you compared any other asset in the organization, so if you people as an asset, what would you do? You'd look after them. So why not treat data as an asset and look after that as well?
Yeah, and I would actually, I don't know if you've got any other examples of bypassing the whole terminology, but I avoid the word data governance as much as possible. It's not like all of us.
Yes.
I mean, we're employees of something. It's not like we have a responsibility in hardware governance or mobile device governance. So why are we all of a sudden being burdened with data governance? But yeah, I don't know. Do you have any other examples of where the term has been bypassed successfully?
Yeah, we hear about it endlessly, and I think this falls into the kind of the discussion around what do the centralized teams of data management people do if you take away the kind of the doing effectively. And I think a big part of it is that the shaping of it, and how do you get a cultural shift to happen? You need the people who can kind of go out and evangelize effectively around the good things that you can do. And the good things that you can do with data, which may rely on data governance, don't need people to know that they're doing data governance. So whether you call themselves data, I've heard data enablement, data empowerment, data excellence, all of those types of things, and obviously data insight. But the message is, the connotation of all of those words is far more positive than the second people hear the word governance. They think risk, they think control, they think taking things off me and stopping me from doing the job that I do. So the second the data governance team come knocking saying we want to help you with something, you don't get a good answer. Whereas if you say I'm the head of data enablement, people go, oh, that sounds like they're going to try to help me do something. And so terminology does matter quite a lot. And we've heard people, whether they call them data champions instead of data owners, whether they call them just data stewards, because stewards is, again, it's more positive than somebody who's going to kind of take the work away from you and stop you being able to deliver on your job.
We should call the next project data bureaucracy and see how well it goes down.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's the reality, isn't it? It does go back to, rightly or wrongly, and again, I think a lot of this comes down to data governance people, and that's coming from myself, having been a data governance person. We have to educate people on what you can get out of data governance, and if that means rebranding ourselves to something else to get the value out of the data, then so be it. But the responsibility comes back to us as professionals to sell vision for what you can do with data, as long as the data can be found, it can be used, it can be understood, it can be trusted. They're the things that we need to strive towards, regardless of whether you call yourself a data governance person, a data owner, a data steward, or whatever else.
Yeah, really good point, and I hope people are paying attention to that. Good. Aaron, it's been a really insightful conversation. I think we could go on for, I don't know how long. As I said, was it 7 or 8 hours? But we're going to start closing off the conversation for now with, again, some of the recurring themes that we want to bring up in this series. So one would be just interesting to hear if there's anything new that you have learned or discovered during this conversation now, any key points for you?
I think just for me, the message as a whole on data mesh, I think with it being quite a new concept, I think you hear data mesh and people go away and search it, and you look at all of the pictures sometimes, and you can kind of get a bit drowned in it, shall we say. But I think if you take it back away from the architectural paradigms and things such as that, I think just the message of what's the aim of data mesh, and it goes back to me, is that the aim of data mesh is just trying to empower people to make the right decisions based on the data that means something to them. And I think just hearing you two kind of that type of statement resonating with you kind of solidifies my thought around it, to kind of take away all of the technology, the architectural designs and things. The message is just make lines of business feel empowered to make good decisions based on their data.
I really like that point. The last words, based on their data. It's their data. It's a good point. We had a question from our previous guest, Minna Kerha, and I think this is well fit for you. Her question was, how could these tool vendors also support the common language in business glossary, so that citizen data scientists or analysts can actually understand and reuse what others have built? So she talks about the language and the glossary.
Yes, absolutely. And again, being an Alation customer, I'm sure she's seen some of the good stuff that we can do. So, and again, I think this goes back to where the data catalogs have kind of shifted, is that people used to think about data catalogs basically being a metadata management tool. So you'd connect two data sources, you'd pull in these are the schemas, tables, and columns that exist. These are the attributes. So is it an integer? Is it a string? All of those types of details. Is it a primary key? And obviously they were useful. But the next level is that if you want to get non-IT people to use it, one, you need to make it user-friendly as an interface so that people actually want to come into it versus never looking at it. And then the other part of it is the English language piece, or the native language piece. So how do you get the business person to start understanding intricacies around data? If we go to a Parquet file, they're never going to go into a data catalog ever again. Whereas if you go in there with an article, so it's kind of like a wiki-like page which has got English definitions or business-focused definitions based on things that probably make more sense to them than anything else they've seen in a data catalog before, they're more likely to stay in it. So a huge piece of it for me is start off at the English language or business language. So whether that is that data domain view, the line of business view of what do people mean by customer, and then think about the types of data attached to customer. So now that we know what a customer is, what types of data would belong to it. So you'd have customers would have names, they would have addresses, they would have phone numbers, email addresses. All of this makes sense to everybody in the organization. And then you pick one of those attributes, and again, at this level, it's still completely agnostic of system, and you say something such as customer name, how would we classify the data? So we may have is it personal data, yes or no flag? We may have a security classification attached to it, all of those types of questions. But the idea is that you don't need to be some huge technologist to be able to answer those questions, because most people in the organization could do so. And then obviously having the role of a data owner or data steward, they'd be kind of effectively the accountable person to make that decision. Then linking that through to the technical data, that's where you can obviously get the huge power out of it. So then if you think about a new data scientist starting the team, they can understand the concepts such as what is a customer, they can understand the types of data that would belong to a customer and how they should treat that data, and then they can seamlessly link through to the actual physical data itself, or physical metadata, to understand where that physical data exists. That journey end to end, from very business focused to very technical focused in a couple of clicks, is where you can really drive adoption from business users, and also hugely speed up the kind of the capability of the data scientists and analytic community as well.
Really good point. And speaking of language, also don't forget to call it something else than data governance, right? In terms of language.
Absolutely.
Um, we're going to speak with data professionals in this series going forward as well. They might be people from software companies or people who are data leaders in their own organizations or other experts. What is a key question that you think we should ask our next guest?
Yes. So kind of on the theme that I've kind of spoken about, I'm really keen to hear how other people think the attitude of data belonging to IT versus belonging to the business has shifted over the past 10 years. So obviously we've spoken around this today, that I've seen it shift a lot from, you go back 10, 15 years ago, the perception was that data belonged to IT and it was IT's problem, and it's slowly changing. So I'm keen to hear how other people have seen that kind of shift over the past 10 years as well.
That's an excellent question. And 10 years, I think, is exactly the right time span to look at things. Cool. Do you have any reading or viewing tips for our listeners? Anything data related or non-data related? It can be anything, essentially.
Ooh, I'll go for a data related and a non-data related one then. So I guess the data related one's probably a bit of a cliche, but the DM box, so data management body of knowledge, it's obviously been around a long time. It's probably a bit of a cliche that somebody in data management says that, but I think no matter how many times you've read it, you can always just go into a specific chapter and it just kind of brings thoughts that you maybe have back into the forefront of your mind, and kind of solidify some of the learnings that you've had over the however long you've been in the industry. So I think it's a really powerful piece. And then obviously Dharma as a whole is really good on kind of helping people on their whole data management journey and kind of getting them kind of just having like-minded people to speak to. Obviously they're a huge body of people, and I think it's a really good network to be involved with. From a non-data one, although I'd probably just tie back to data as a whole, is so there's a book called the Rap Yearbook, and it literally goes through every year in hip hop since I think 1979, and it goes through kind of breakthroughs in whether it's the music or culture and things such as that in every year from 79 onwards. So probably a bit niche for data people, but if you like hip hop and you like data, it's probably up there as the best books you can get.
Awesome, excellent. We'll put links for these in the episode notes or information. I'm definitely going to look up the book because I'm massively interested in music. So excellent. Cool. We're recording this at the end of June, so here in Finland, we're getting ready for our long summer break. What about you, Aaron? What's next for you this week or this summer? Any special activities?
Unfortunately, no hot long summer in the UK. So I've got a couple of weeks of work still working with clients, trying to get them to think about how they're using the catalogue to get more value out of it. And a big part of that is showing the value. So I think a lot of organizations, they go away, they see the vision for what you can get out of a catalog, and then kind of get head down into using it, and then kind of trying to get them to take a step back and think about the success criteria, the KPIs and metrics to make them understand whether they're getting the most out of the catalog, and then obviously showing the value to the stakeholders effectively is a big piece of it. But then kind of personally, obviously COVID's put a lot of limitations around where we can go. So we're fortunate enough to have a camper van, so we can travel around the UK. So I've kind of got a couple of weeks away where we can get out and see the rest of Britain in its glory, as long as it's a sunny day.
Nice. That sounds really good. Well, this has been a really, really insightful and great conversation. So, Aaron, thanks again for coming on the show, and look forward to meeting you one day when all of this is over. But yeah, thank you so much for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for the time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Aaron. Lasse, that was a great conversation with Aaron about data catalogs. Of course, we're talking with Alation here. There was also a lot of talk about data governance. You know, what do you make out of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, Aaron obviously has a long history of data governance, and he studied the subject. I know he's got views on what the drivers have been, how data governance has evolved. So that's always fascinating to hear. We talked about language in two different contexts, at least. One was just the language, the word governance. He also had really good points on, a data catalog being a place where you can surface multiple definitions of the data, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. So really, really important themes and topics that came up. I know, Ante, you said that you had a couple of points that you really wanted to summarize from this. So what were those points for you?
Yeah, this one thing that sort of kept repeating in Aaron's conversation was that, how do you manage everything centrally, or is it distributed? And with everything, it's not binary. It's not that if you distribute out, you don't have any governance, you don't have any control. Whereas if you have everything in a central basket, if you have everything in a monolith, that you would have high governance. I think it's about finding the balance. It's finding the balance of, what do you distribute out? What do you have centrally? Is it a center of excellence? And how do you govern what you do in these domains? And I think that was sort of a thing that stuck to me. It's about finding the balance. And there's of course no right and wrong answer, but that's where we have to look for.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, speaking of balance, another theme that came up, maybe more indirectly, but it's also the shift of the central IT function from being more of a doing function to now being more of a facilitating and strategizing functions. That's an interesting evolution as well. All right, real good stuff. We are in Finland at the time of recording. We are approaching our summer holidays, so we're going to take some time off to enjoy the hot sun on our summer cabins, and obviously get bitten by mosquitoes and do all the types of things that we do in summer. We will be back with new energy in August, and hopefully with new guests and new episodes. Stay tuned. Make sure that you like and subscribe and follow us on whichever channel you watch this on or listen on, so that you know when we have new episodes coming out. But for now, we thank you all for tuning in, and make sure you stay tuned so you know when we have more slices of data coming out. Thank you, everyone, and bye for now.
Bye.